Good afternoon. Dear students, dear guests, dear Vice Rector, dear colleagues. First of all, I would like to thank each one of you for joining our first MCC Transylvania Lectures. Our plan is to provide monthly a platform to discuss the topics, issues, and thoughts which preoccupy today's intellectuals with foreign speakers. I would also like to offer my regards to all the people who made this seminar functional in such hard times. With all those words, I'm extremely delighted to present our guest, Mr. Peter Kurti, Director of the Culture, Prosperity and Civil Society Program. He is also adjunct associate professor in the School of Law at the University of Notre Dame, Australia, and adjunct research fellow at the Australian Centre for Christianity and Culture at Sturt University. He has written extensively about issues of religion, liberty, and civil society in Australia, and appears frequently as a commentator on television and radio. He is a fellow of Royal Society of Arts and ordinate ministry of the Anglican Church of Australia. So without consuming any time, I would like to call upon Mr. Peter Kurti and our academic unit director, Mr. András Betlandi, to accompany us on the stage. Peter, András, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Professor. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for being here. It is a pleasure and a great honor. This is the first seminar of the series Transylvania Lectures, and as Boton told us, we have big plans. We try to invite great thinkers from all over the world and to discuss the most actual problems and issues in the world, and we will try to get a perspective through our guests, what probably we wouldn't have if we would discuss only between each other. So we try to inspire new discussions, new debates in our smaller society here in Kolozsvár, here in Pennsylvania. Professor, we have 3 words in our title: tradition, tolerance, and ambiguity. Please tell us, what is the reason why you chose these 3 concepts? What does these mean for you as an Australian? And what do you think, what can we learn from your Australian experience?
Thank you, András, and thank you very much to everyone at MCC for your kind invitation to be here. It's a great honor for me to be the first Transylvania lecturer, and my first visit to Romania, to Transylvania, to Kolozsvár. So it's been a great time and a very interesting time. And I was saying to András earlier that every conversation I've had while I've been here has helped me to think again about this topic and to think about the way in which I frame it in my own mind. So what I say now has been informed by what I've learned over the weekend, and would have been probably a bit different from what I would have said on Friday when I arrived. The 3 words, tradition, tolerance, and ambiguity, I think are very important, because what I'm interested in what I'm thinking about, what I'm interested in, is what makes each of us a good citizen in the community in which we live. What does it take to be a good citizen? Sometimes we think that we need government to do things for us. We need government we just make demands of government, and that citizenship is about nothing more than making demands of government. Sometimes life in Australia can feel a bit like that. We like government to sort out problems for us. But I think there is much more to being a citizen than that. And in fact, and I think we'll come to this later, but I will just say, I think that in Transylvania, the experience of Hungarians living in Transylvania has a lot to teach us about citizenship and being a citizen in societies, in a society where there are other traditions and other cultures living alongside us. So the first word, tradition. I think that to be a good citizen, we have to be mindful of the tradition in which we stand. We have to honor our tradition, we have to recognize our tradition, and I think be informed about our tradition and be proud of it, and to allow our tradition to inform the decisions and choices that we make. The second word, tolerance, is important because when one or more traditions are coexisting with each other, it's important for us to practice tolerance. And what do I mean by tolerance? Tolerance in part means respect. I think when we are tolerant of people, we are respectful, but it doesn't mean that we necessarily agree with them. Nor do I think tolerance means indifference. It doesn't mean that we don't care about the things from which we differ. Rather, I think tolerance is a specific and intentional action whereby we choose not to make a claim against somebody, or we choose not to assert something against somebody, but accept the fact that there are two or more different opinions that exist at the same time. So tolerance grows out of our awareness of our own tradition. We know about our tradition, we're proud of our tradition, and that in turn, I think, helps us to understand that other people equally have traditions of which they are proud, and that we need to practice the virtue of tolerance as part of citizenship. And the third word, ambiguity, which I know sounds a bit odd because I've been speaking in quite certain terms about what we have to do in terms of tradition or tolerance, and now I'm saying that ambiguity is an important part of being a good citizen. Why is that? Well, the reason, I think, is that when there are one or more traditions living alongside one another, and when we have to practice the virtue of tolerance, it will mean that there are questions, there are aspects of our common life in a society that are not resolved. There will be differences that are not resolved. There are things that we have to live with, even if they make us uncomfortable. But we can't expect government to come and resolve all differences, as I said a moment ago. And so I think the third component of the title, ambiguity, reminds us that sometimes things are just not clear and things are just not resolved, and that we learn to live with that ambiguity. It requires, I think, a considerable degree of maturity, of emotional maturity and psychological and social maturity. But we need to learn to live with ambiguity and to accept that ambiguity is not a bad thing, but in a way creates a positive space in which we can continue to work together, in which we can continue to practice the virtues of tolerance, in which we continue to learn about our tradition. Because I think that citizenship is something that is always evolving. It's never fixed, it's never fast, and we always have duties, new duties and responsibilities that arise.
Thank you very much. I forgot to say that you got some flyers on your seats about the Mentimeter application, so I have this privilege to put questions to Mr. Kurti, but you also have this opportunity. So if you have any question, you can write me the question, and I will try to build in to this discussion your questions, but in case I will not manage to build in my way of discussion, then in the last 15 minutes I will put the questions to Mr. Kurti and you will get the answer. Okay, you may get the answer, yeah. Okay, what you told us sounds really nice as a principle, but can you give us an example where ambiguity was or is the solution, or where people simply didn't manage to find the right solution and there is still a fueling conflict between communities or between individuals?
It's probably easier for me to give you an example of the latter, which I bring from Australia, where the question of religious tolerance is particularly pressing at the moment, not in terms of the tolerance between different religious groups, between Christians and Muslims, for example, or Christians and Jews. In fact, in that respect, Australia is a very tolerant society, and people from different religious groups do show a great deal of respect and understanding of one another. I mean, that's a general claim. I'm not saying there is never any tension, but on the whole, religious groups do respect one another, and they respect that they accept that there are differences in teaching, but do accept that in some ways people who live by a religious faith view the world in a slightly different way, and we have that in common. However, Australia is a very secular society, which I think is a good thing, but in that secular society, and I'll just say why I think it's a good thing is because we don't want a society, we don't want the government to be run by bishops or imams or rabbis. We don't want that. We don't want to live in a theocracy. So it's very good that the secular government, we have a secular democracy in which allegiance to God or to gods or a god is not a significant part of the formulation of policy. But in that secular society, there are people who are very determined to silence the voice of citizens who have religious beliefs. And this has become difficult because religious people have, and it's come about through issues related to human sexuality and transgender, which is something that we are facing very much in Australia at the moment. But many people in religious communities take a different view of the appropriateness of transgenderism, for example. They don't judge the people, they don't hate people who are transgender, but they don't feel that they can accept the secular society's argument that it's okay and it's a way of life that should be embraced. So they stand against it. They say we don't agree with it, we would never condemn an individual, but we don't think it's appropriate. So that just broadly sketches the issue, and it's been very contentious in Australia because anyone who voices a dissenting opinion can be not just shouted down, but actually vilified and hounded on social media, and it can get quite unpleasant. Where I think ambiguity would be a really good thing is if we were all able to accept that we perhaps take a different view about transgender, that there are people who think that transgender people, or rather the practice of transgender should be something that is simply accepted without question, and that we should not have any concerns at all about embracing what some regard as an ideology. If we were to live with ambiguity, or a greater degree of ambiguity, we might accept and be more willing to accept that some people think of it this way, some people think of it that way, and that those issues won't be necessarily resolved, but that we can learn to live with and accommodate one another's points of view. The absence of ambiguity, which I think is a characteristic of Australian society at the moment, the absence of ambiguity means that no dissent is tolerated, no negative opinion can be expressed, and that unless people subscribe to a prevailing secular ideology about transgender, what they have to say or what they think or what their institution stands for is simply unacceptable. Now that makes life very hard for the faith-based communities, for faith-based schools. I can imagine how it could become an issue in institutions such as aged care facilities, but it's an issue certainly in schools because, for example, a Christian school, a Catholic school will say, well, we want to teach courses in accordance with the tenets of our faith. We want to teach in a way that accords with the Christian faith, and we don't want to have a secular ideology imposed upon us. Because that is something that has become, that's a very contentious position to adopt, it's become quite difficult, quite heated, and quite bitter in some respects. And I think if we were able to live with ambiguity, learn to be comfortable with ambiguity, we would find that in fact the tensions inherent in this sort of issue lessen. I don't say they disappear, but I think that they lessen. So that would be an example from my own experience.
Thank you very much. It seems to me that you say somehow that from the secular perspective, citizens of Australia, many of them, think about the religious institutions or about the churches in general, that they are intolerant. Now my question is, how can we deal in a tolerant way with the intolerance? Because from their perspective, they say that these schools, these institutions are intolerant towards different sexual minorities or different opinions and so on. So is there a way to deal tolerantly with intolerance? Can we tolerate intolerance?
Well, I think in a way we have to tolerate intolerance if we are committed to the ideal of a liberal society. Because I don't think liberalism, about which people have written vast amounts, but I don't think liberalism can be defined in terms of a single prescription, or it can be defined as a single doctrine to which we assent. I think liberalism is better described as a form of practice, and that it involves accepting that different people will have different points of view about things and that we need to learn to accept them. So I think a truly liberal society is one which is defined not so much by a single doctrine but by a practice, a way of being. So I think in some ways we have to tolerate intolerance, but I do think that in a liberal society we can speak out against intolerance and call out intolerance where we experience it and say, this is intolerant. You can say, you're free to say what you want, and freedom of speech is very important, freedom of conscience and freedom of association, they're all very important. So you can say these things, but don't think there are no consequences to what you say. So I think that intolerance, a tolerant way of dealing with intolerance, is to confront it, is to name it, and to in a way to try to dispel it, to lessen, to reduce it, to dissolve it. That's not always easy, of course, but I think that if we want to be tolerant ourselves, we have to be capable of practicing, of accepting intolerance, but not agreeing with the intolerant.
Okay, what do you recommend for someone who is believing in the universal values? Both of us are lawyers. We know about the human rights, and the basis of the human rights are some universal values. Can we be ambiguous when there is a universal value versus something else, tradition, let's say the value of tradition also? How can we find a solution for that, or we don't need solution for that because the universal value is always prevailing and always has it is stronger always, and then we don't have to deal with that problem.
So in this question, what would be an example of a universal value? What sort of thing are you thinking of?
Probably one of them would be the non-discrimination value, but also the freedom of speech, the freedom of religion. So we have these rights are recognized internationally. They have a universal acceptance. And what do we do when we meet a culture, we meet a tradition? It can be any kind of religious or non-religious tradition. When these rights don't prevail, and let's say probably most of the Western world agrees that forced child labor is not okay. But if there would be a cultural group, which would say that forced child labor is acceptable, how should we respect that tradition, or we shouldn't? What is your answer to this?
That's an interesting way of putting it. I'm going to take issue with you about universal values. I think there are universal values or principles. I don't think anti-discrimination is one of those principles. I don't think it is inherently bad to discriminate. For example, in the Catholic Church, if you're a woman, you can't be ordained a priest. Or I don't think you can be ordained deacon. You certainly can't be ordained priest, and you can't be ordained a bishop. So the Catholic Church, I don't mean to pick on the Catholic Church, because there are parts of the Anglican Church to which I belong, which also doesn't ordain women to the priesthood or as bishops. The what society says in that instance is that, yes, this is discriminatory behaviour. Yes, the church is discriminating against women in that it's not going to appoint them to these positions. But we carve out some exemptions because of religion, because as a religious institution, a religious organisation, we're going to afford it an exemption. So when the Catholic Church exercises this right not to appoint women to positions, it is discriminating. It's discriminating against them. But we accept that. We say that is a socially acceptable form of discrimination. We don't say it's not discrimination. On the contrary, we say yes, it is, and we grant an exemption. So I don't think anti-discrimination is a universal value in the sense that you define it. But I do think there are fundamental principles and rights such as the freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of conscience, freedom of association. In fact, I'm one of those people who think that in fact there are fewer fundamental human rights than many suggest today. The list of rights in some ways seems to be just growing and growing. So you have the right to just about anything you want, and eventually the United Nations will endorse it and there'll be a commission. But I don't think that's right. I think there are a few fundamental human rights, as I say, freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom of conscience. Now, the freedom to discriminate in the way that a church might discriminate is part of the practice of freedom of religion. I think it's part of the practice of freedom of speech and part of the practice of freedom of association. So if we are mindful of what those freedoms are, or what the fundamental freedoms are, and if we are prepared to defend those, I think we will see that it's not that everyone who feels put upon can have a claim in law or even a moral claim against the organisation or the person whom they feel has done them wrong, but rather we need to appeal to those fundamental rights, those fundamental principles, and see how the practices that we might like or might not like fit into that matrix. So I think it's better to keep fewer rather than more rights in mind, and then to build upon that basis. Because otherwise we get too many rights, and what the American scholar Aaron Rhodes leads to what he calls the debasement of rights, because there are just so many rights that it becomes a meaningless exercise. So I think I would distinguish between the anti-discrimination and the freedoms. I prefer to think of rights as rights to something, freedom for freedom of something, and that on the basis of that we get our thinking right about particular practices in particular circumstances.
It seems to me that we can reconnect to your basic line that somehow individual citizens should find their way of living together and not wait from the state to find a solution for that. And always when we have rights, actually the state is granting those rights. So actually what happens when the number of rights are growing, we are getting limited. We can have less and less decision about how to resolve our way of living, our conflicts with others, or even how to organize our way of living, because the state starts to somehow go inside in our private life. Now, my question is, before you said that you don't like theocracies. Why don't you like it? Somehow the churches within the secular world are small theocracies. Am I wrong?
Well, to the extent that the churches don't make the laws that govern our society, yes, I don't think that is.
But they are making the laws which govern their institutions.
I don't think that's the same. I don't think that's the same thing. I don't think that a church which passes laws to govern the life of the church, it means that the church is a theocracy. I think it means that the church is simply ordering its life in the way that it should be free to do. I think it would be a theocracy if we had bishops making laws about the rest of us in society and deciding where we could live, what occupations we could hold, whether or not we could drive cars, or whether or not we could drink alcohol, and things like that. So I think it's when that lawmaking extends to every aspect of society and binds members of society that we're talking about a theocracy. I think that's quite different from, I mean, you might just say, well, a church school might make decisions about what pupils can wear or not wear, what the uniform needs to be, and attendance and so forth. Does that make the school a theocracy? I would say it doesn't. I would say the school is ordering its life according to the tenets of its faith.
Okay, and what should we learn here in Europe, here in Central Eastern Europe, from the Australian example? I can see that there is some frustration in Australia. In some communities, some religious communities are frustrated because of this conflict between the secular and non-secular world. Somehow the secular world got empowered through the rights granted by the state, and they cannot protect their tradition, their way of life, their way of thinking about, they lose their right to decide about the schooling of their child. Now my question is, what should we learn here in a secular Eastern Europe?
Well, I think one of the lessons that can be learned derives from a just slight change I'd like to make in the way you presented that question of rights. Because I don't think rights are conferred by the state. I think rights are, which is why we have things like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, or the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, to which governments, including the government of Australia, subscribe, they sign it. I don't think governments or states create or confer rights. I think rights...
They recognize something.
They recognize, that is true, but they don't confer. Because what I think a right is, it's a right that you or I have, in ideal terms, against the state. It's a way in which a right creates a freedom that you and I have that cannot be interfered with by the state. So the freedom of speech, freedom of association would say, you and I are free here to associate tonight at the Collegium. We're here, and the state is not going to come and tell us that we can't meet and have this conversation. If the state were to come and make itself felt and say, no, actually you can't talk about these things, you can't meet here tonight, we would want to assert our right to freedom of speech, our right to freedom of association, as it were, to keep the state away. So I think rights are something that in human beings, they're recognized by states, but they're not conferred by states. So the reason I'm saying that is because, as you know, I've been here a very short period of time, but you and I have had a series of interesting conversations over the last few days about just this sort of thing. I think that we can't always expect the state to resolve every difference, every tension, every dispute between citizens. And I'm going to just cite a small example which I may well not understand adequately, but it was an example that you pointed out to me that was very striking, that street signs are in English and Romanian sometimes, but not in Hungarian. And how does one feel about that if you're a Hungarian in Transylvania? Irritated, irked, annoyed, you take note of it, you think, it's not quite the way I'd like it to be, but do people protest? Do you go to the government and say, well, we want the law changed in order to have street signs in Hungarian as well? Or do you choose
They do with some.
Okay, but, well...
It wasn't me.
Okay, but it also seems to me that what one can do is choose to live with it, is choose to accept it, and you as it were, take that in, and you think, okay, well, I know that, but I'm not going to allow that to distract me from the way I live. I'm not going to be distracted by things that are on the surface small but actually are significant because they go to the depths of my culture. But this is not something that the state can or even perhaps should resolve, because even if the law changed, would that change the way people feel about one another in a society? I'm not sure it would. I think sometimes we want a law to set down parameters in the hope that it will change the way humans think. It can change behavior, but does it change attitudes? Sometimes yes, but not always. And so what I'm struck with here, and this is how the word ambiguity, I think, became clearer to me in the course of our conversations and the time of my being here, is that sometimes not everything can be resolved, and that we don't know how we're going to resolve difference. We just don't know, but we can live with it. And I think the experience that comes from living with ambiguity actually strengthens us and enhances the capacities that each of us have to be responsible citizens. So that's how I would answer your question.
Okay, thank you very much. I was wondering, listening to you, that the title of this course was also making competent citizens. So this is the competence about what you were thinking. So living with this ambiguity, not waiting to be solved by the state, and still feeling yourself comfortable in that society. That's about what you talk when you say making competent citizens, after these three words: tradition, tolerance, and ambiguity.
Yes, it is. Very much so. I come from a country where what's known as the politics of identity is quite prevalent, in which groups assert rights over other groups, and that if you are, for example, and this is a point that was made by the American author Heather MacDonald last week at the MCC summit in Budapest, and those of you who there heard that session would have heard her say this, that if you are, for example, a white heterosexual man, you are just always and everywhere you're in a position of power, and you're going to be an oppressor, and that there are going to be victims, and that the victims are always enjoy our support, and that those who are oppressors must always be denounced. Well, and we know, I mean, in Australia that is something that is making itself felt. It's certainly making itself felt in the United States and the UK. What's interesting to me about the politics of identity and the way of looking at society like that is that it has some sort of ideal, what a colleague of mine last week referred to as a utopian ideal. There's a standard to which we simply can't aspire, and a standard that we will, or we can aspire, but a standard that to which we will never attain. And this utopian ideal is actually very unhelpful, because if we can't attain something, if we can't realize something, we will always feel that we have failed. We will always be looking for another victim, and we'll be always looking for somebody else to denounce as an oppressor. So I want to contrast that approach to political life, where we seek this to implement or to attain a utopian ideal, with the business of living as citizens in a liberal society. That is to say, a society which is marked by the acceptance of difference and by commitment to accepting that some people will see things differently from us. And in such a society, we have to trade off. We have to make compromises. We have to deal with one another as we are. I think living in human society has never been easy. And I mean, we may feel that today it's even harder because of social media and the pressure that puts us under. But one only has to go back to Christian scriptures and look at the letters that St. Paul wrote to the churches that he founded and see, some of the wretched conditions that he was having to address, dealing with very recognizable patterns of human behavior and human failing. Living in society, living in community is not easy. It's a challenge, which is why I think, for example, the monastic life is such a challenge. It requires eternal vigilance and an eternal commitment to building competence. Now, I speak about competent citizens because I think those are the sorts of skills that we need to cultivate as citizens. And we also need to be realistic about how difficult it is. And that we will fail, we will be frustrated, people will misunderstand us, we will upset people, we will not be understood ourselves. But that doesn't mean that we are failing or that others are failing. But it's a continual process of cultivating competence and committing ourselves to forging, to building, creating a better society. And in fact, speaking about St. Paul, I think sometimes the letters that he writes or that he wrote to those Christian churches can be very encouraging, because, say, well, in 2,000 years, not a lot has changed, and we recognize ourselves in the behaviors that Paul calls out. So that's why I think that tolerance, tradition, tolerance, and ambiguity are all an important part of making competent citizens, because I think competence is a skill. It's something that we have to cultivate. We don't just wake up one morning and find that we're competent citizens. It's something we have to work at on a regular basis.
You have a methodology for that? How can we teach it?
How we teach it?
Yeah. How can we make citizens competent?
Well, I think that in a way, having discussions like this is a form of teaching. I think that I'm not saying that the only way of doing it is by joining a church or a religious community, but I think that being a member of a religious community, being a member of a congregation, can be a way of learning that. Being part of a voluntary association, which involves, what in English we call give and take, a bit of compromise, that can be important. But I think that having discussions like this at MCC is a very important way of doing it. And I think one of the things that I find so interesting about the work of Matthias Corvinus Collegium is the way in which it brings together people from a wide diversity of backgrounds from within Transylvania. You put everyone together and say, okay, now we have to learn to live with one another and live and learn from one another. So I think it's not, I don't have a methodology in the sense that I have a reading list and a set of exercises you can do, but there are ways of living that we can cultivate. There are ways of living that we can adopt and practice that I think help to forge confidence. I have to say, I think that just this sort of conversation is one of those ways of doing that. We'll see when it comes to the questions whether or not that thesis it prevails, whether it's accurate or not, but I think that is a way of doing it.
Do you know any society today which would pass your test of ambiguity, which works in a way that you presume that, okay, the majority of this society is competent citizen from this perspective? Is there any Western society which is a good example for that? Or non-Western?
I'll have to think about that. Nothing comes to mind immediately. I think that in the last 20 years, societies that we might have looked at, in Scandinavia, for example, as possible examples have come under certain kinds of strain. I wonder whether, and I'm thinking aloud now, I wonder whether looking at the way in which different governments responded to, or different countries responded to the COVID pandemic is a way of answering that question. And Sweden will be an example where there were fewer restrictions and people were allowed to go on living their lives, and there was an acceptance of a higher level of risk than, for example, there was in my own country, Australia. Maybe that's an indication, but I can't think of maybe there's some work to be done there, and we can plot on a graph responses to COVID and work out whether or not that shows a kind of comfort with ambiguity. I think countries where people have to live alongside others are probably better at it. And in the country in which I was born, England of course is part of the United Kingdom. We have England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. There are strong tendencies to urges and desires for devolved government, and in some cases for independence. That's a society that seems to be able to live with the ambiguity of uncertainty, in the sense that those issues have not yet been resolved, but to work towards living in a harmonious way whilst those questions are being resolved. I'm not sure those are particularly good examples, but they're the ones that come to mind as we speak.
Am I right that it seems to me that a society which would somehow accept this ambiguity would mean that the state wouldn't intrude in the life of the people so much? It would leave the citizens to decide on their own about more things. So it wouldn't be the prototype of the caring state. It would be rather a respectful state, to say so. It would respect the I don't know, the decision and the ideas of the citizens, but not caring so much about the result.
I think that's right. I think that's right. And I mean, coming back to continuing with the COVID analogy, Australia became very famous around the world for its, in some instances, the imposition of draconian restrictions. And many people oppose this in Australia. I mean, and it provokes a lot of controversy. And many would say, why should the state be making all these decisions? Why can't the state allow me to decide how I'm going to live in my community, with members of my community, with members of my family? Leave the decision to me. Leave it to me to make that, to evaluate the risk and to make a decision. And I think there was a lot of, I know there was a lot of objection to the very heavy-handed way in which the state would say, no, we know best, we're going to keep you safe, now do as you're told.
We feel pretty safe here in Europe when we see that we have an insurance, health insurance, granted by the state, for example. When we see them in the USA, for example, the state believes that people can assume responsibility for their decisions, and we see that people die because of that. What would be the opposite example? You said that Sweden might be something similar to your ideal country from this perspective. Which is the too much caring state?
The too much caring state?
Yeah, the too much caring state, which already doesn't recognize your ability to decide about your life, to decide about your health, to decide about the education of your kids, to decide about even your opinion, to say so.
It would seem to me that that could be said of any totalitarian regime that did not allow citizens the independence to make their own choices and to lead their own lives freely. Whether, you know, we can all think of totalitarian regimes in today's world. I would think that the absence of freedom in life, absence of freedom when it comes to living under such a regime would be just such an example of that. I think that, if I may say so, I think the state may say, such a state may say, but we're caring for you. We're caring for you.
They used to say that.
Yes, that's right. But I don't think now we would necessarily accept that. We say, this is not caring, this is controlling. But I think totalitarian regimes, I hesitate to say, well, this is what it would have been like here before the revolution, because I never had the experience of living under communism or living in a totalitarian regime. But from what I've read and what I've heard talking to people, I think that could be the sort of experience one would have under a totalitarian regime, where you were not allowed to make decisions for yourself, and that if you contravened the diktat of the state, you would pay a heavy penalty for it.
We are heading to the end of the seminar. We have 15 minutes for questions, so before we finish, just grab your phone and write your question. Before I start to read the questions, if there would be anything more what you would like to add to this discussion.
Well, no, I'm really keen to know what you and the audience think of this, and tell me whether I'm on the wrong track or whether there are things you disagree with. I'd be very interested to hear from you. In some ways, these are new ideas. I've written a lot about civil society, and I've written a lot about the role and place of citizens with religious beliefs in secular society. But the notion of ambiguity has started to come to my mind in recent months as we've dealt with issues of religious tolerance or intolerance in Australia. And so these thoughts have been uppermost in my mind for quite a long time. It's been great to have this conversation that you and I have had, but I'd be very interested to know whether or not I'm persuading you, and if I'm not persuading you, why I'm not persuading you. So that would be something I'd be very keen to know, very interested to know.
Okay, so before I read the first question, I don't know, does the audience see the questions, what I see, or only I am seeing them? Oh, you see them, okay. So before I put the first question, may I ask the audience who agrees with you, who doesn't agree,
yeah, I'm in your
and
hands.
who has no idea?
I'm in your hands.
Okay, so first, who is confused and has no idea about this topic and doesn't know why is here? Is there anybody? You can be honest and courageously raise your hand. Okay, who doesn't agree with Professor Peter Kurti? Okay, who agree? Oh, there was one, 2, 3. Okay, 4, 5. I saw. Okay, so please raise your hands. Really, I encourage you to don't agree with Mr. Kurti. And who agrees with Mr. Kurti? Okay.
Slightly more.
Okay, so I start. There was a
Thank you very much.
There was a provocative question for you. Briefly, the question is, how could we learn from someone who doesn't know our society? What is your answer for that?
Oh, well, that's a very good question. How could we learn from someone who doesn't know our society? I think that, let me turn that around. How could I, who don't know your society, learn from you? Well, I think that works because I bring my own ideas and theories and forms of practice that are formed in my mind, and I hold them up against the template of your society, and I see whether they fit, whether they work or not. I certainly don't say that I come to your society with answers to tell you how to live. I don't think I can do that, but I think I can observe the way in which you live with one another and observe the way from the way in which you conduct yourselves in your society. I think I can learn things from about that to take back to my own society. If that were not possible, I think I would despair, because it would mean that I could actually, I mean, if you want to extend that principle, I would think you'd have to say you can't learn from anybody who doesn't know anything about you. And I don't think that's true. I think we do learn from one another. I learn from people about whom I know less than I would like to know. And I think if we don't allow ourselves to learn from what is unfamiliar, then we limit ourselves and we limit opportunities for growth. So I would rather turn it around and say, what can I learn from your society, a society that I don't know well? I would say, well, I can learn these things. I'm not coming here saying to you, let me tell you how I think you should live your society, and how you should live in your society. That would be absurd, it would be foolish, it would be also quite arrogant.
I remember our first discussion was, in our first discussion you told us, I don't want to tell them how you should live, I don't know you. Okay.
I can't.
One of the first questions, or maybe the first one, was your opinion about sexuality and gender.
Well, humans, I'm not quite sure I understand what you're asking me to say. My opinion about sex, I think human sexuality is a part of human identity. I don't really have a strong view about that. I think that gender clearly is an issue for many people. It's a point of identity or shifting identity for people. I can't enter into that experience either, frankly, for that matter, because I identify as a white heterosexual male of a certain age. I don't really know much about that. I can say much more. I'm not concerned, and in my work, although I've been criticized for this, it is honestly the truth that I have not taken a position on issues of human sexuality, because it's just not something that I want to write about. It's not something that I want to argue about. What I have done is argue that people who have a religious point of view about human sexuality should be free to state those views in ways that are respectful and not hateful or vindictive. But I myself don't really have any views about sexuality and gender, other than to say I think they are an important part of human personality and human identity, and that they are live political issues at the moment. But I don't know if there's much more I can say than that.
Thank you. An easier question: who was your role model when you was younger?
Oh. I'm not sure I had a role model. I think there are people who've influenced me, teachers. Teachers have influenced me, people who have responded, I think, in interesting ways to challenges, who've acted with courage and integrity on the basis of their convictions. But I don't think I had any singular role model. And certainly not in the sense that there's somebody whom I wanted to emulate. I think I'm a bit like a magpie. And is it magpies? Are those the birds that take bits from, I think it is, or is it the cuckoo? I can't remember, I'm not very good on birds. Anyway, a bird that takes things from different nests. I think it's a cuckoo. I'm not sure. So I take things that I like and I think are important and of help, but I'm not quite sure I could say I had any particular role model.
Okay, one more question. In your ideal society, how would people handle the patriarchy?
Well, I think in an ideal society there probably wouldn't be a patriarchy.
So you shouldn't deal with that.
Let me just say something, just see if I can say something more helpful than that. I think that I think one of the things for me that Christianity, I mean, I became a Christian when I was at university. I wasn't brought up as a Christian. It was a conscious intellectual decision that I made when I was about your age, actually. I think that Christianity, although I know critics of Christianity will say, yeah, but it keeps women in their place. I don't think Christianity does do that. Sometimes I think it is the gospel and Christian scriptures are not interpreted in ways that are helpful. But I think what we learn from the Christian gospel is the fundamental equality of human beings in the eyes of God, and that each of us enjoys the status of being created in the image of God. And I don't think that men should have authority over women, nor that women should have authority over men, but I think that all of us have skills and gifts that I think we need to be able to contribute freely in our societies, in our churches, in our homes, in our places of work. I think in my ideal society, as I said a moment ago, I think this is actually what I would say, is that there would be no patriarchy. There would not be exercise of power on the basis of gender or sex, but that there would be a capacity for working in partnership and working in a collegial way with one another based on our skills and our personalities rather than our gender.
I don't necessarily disagree with you, but aren't you saying that society would be better if people were just kinder to each other?
Well, I think, yes, actually, I think a bit of kindness wouldn't come amiss, actually. Because what is kindness? Kindness involves empathy, and it involves a willingness to see oneself in the place of another. So I think that one can be generous, for example, without being kind. You know, I can give you the jacket I'm wearing, or I can give you food without actually being particularly nice or kind. But I think kindness suggests more than just a willingness to share stuff, but a readiness to enter into the lives of the life of another person, and to put yourself in their position and to empathize with them. So yes, actually, I think if we were kinder to each other, that would actually be quite a significant thing to do. Was it George H.W. Bush, I think, who spoke about, he slightly misused the English language, but he spoke about wanting to build a kindler, gentler nation. It was either that or his son. But it was quite an misuse of the word kinder, because he said kindler, but a kinder, more gentle nation. If we were kind to one another, if we were more gentle with one another, I think that would be a very good starting point.
One more popular question. Your example was Sweden and other Scandinavian countries. These countries aren't famous for being religious countries. That are religious often show high levels of intolerance. Aren't you contradicting yourself?
Sorry, can you
so
say
that Sweden and other Scandinavian countries are not necessarily very religious, but religious countries used to be more intolerant, or they show a high level of intolerance. Don't you contradict yourself? This is the question.
Okay, that's a good question. I think nowadays in many countries in Western Europe, and it's true in Scandinavia, yes, religious observance is declining, but there is quite a strong Christian ethos, and often it's the Reformed Christian ethos that informs those societies and the values of those societies. But it's true to say that religious observance is declining. Sorry, the second part of the question?
Don't you contradict yourself that you bring Scandinavian countries as good examples, meanwhile they are not religious at all?
So I'm using the godless of good examples, but what did the question ask about religious?
Just a second. I don't have the question already on my desk here. If I didn't ask the question right, just write it again, please, and I will put the question again. But if I remember well, the question was, if Scandinavian countries are good examples and these countries are non-religious, meanwhile some religious countries are really intolerant.
Yes, okay.
over many.
That's what I thought. I just wanted to clarify that. I'm not saying that every manifestation of religion is a manifestation of tolerance. We know that's not true.
So Talibans are not necessarily tolerant?
I would say they err on the side of intolerant.
Okay.
But I think that religion, Christianity, Judaism, have the capacity to foster a spirit of tolerance. I'm hesitating because, of course, we know that Christians fight like mad against each other. And I've got some Jewish friends in Sydney. He's a rabbi and of a particular tradition. And he's told me that rabbis from different traditions of Judaism would simply not mix with one another because they just would be so far apart in terms of theology and ideology. So we know that religious people, being religious doesn't make you tolerant, and sometimes the religious people are intolerant because it breeds a form of tolerance. What I am saying, though, is that I believe that if we are faithful, if we're true to the gospel, if we're true to, speaking of Christianity now, if we're true to the tenets of the Christian faith, and remember who we are, as I said, created in the image of God, we're all, to use religious language, we're all redeemed sinners. We're all people who have sinned and fallen short in the sight of God and can only be restored to fullness and wholeness in the eyes of God. That, I think, breeds a sort of humility, or ought to breed a sort of humility. It's what I preach about when I'm in the pulpit talking about things. I'm not urging people to go out and thump those with whom they disagree. I want people to be mindful of the fact that we all share a common human experience. And then if we're mindful of that common human experience of being sinners redeemed by God, we will be more empathetic, or we ought to be more empathetic and more tolerant of others. Clearly, it doesn't always cash out like that, and that just goes to show how imperfect and challenging and never-ending the quest to live in human society is.
A question with an actual political angle, because in Hungary it was legally regularized that a mother is a woman, a father is a man. What is your opinion about that? Not about the Hungarian law, but about this statement. Do you think a mother should be a woman and the father should be a man?
Well, I think it depends how you define mother. I think if we say that a mother is a person who gives birth to a child, who conceives and gives birth to a child after a period of gestation, then yes, it would seem to me that a mother could only be a woman, but if we want to interpret mother in a different way and say that it's actually not about a biological function, but a series of social roles, it will be up to one to argue that a mother is not a woman. My own view would be that a mother is a woman, and that my own experience of my own mother is that, well, she was a woman, and had she not been a woman, she probably wouldn't have been a mother.
Okay, thank you very much. Here are a lot of other questions, and it's really amazing. We are not used to this attitude that the audience is so courageous. Maybe the application helps it. One last question. Professor, do you have Central European ancestors?
Oh, yes.
Because of your name.
No, that's an easy question, and not a controversial one. Yes, I do, but not Hungarian. My father was Austrian, was born in Vienna. Kurti is quite a common name. It was Kurti with the umlaut. It's quite a common name. I think it's still a very common name. There was in England a number of years ago a very distinguished Hungarian professor of low temperature physics, Nicholas Kurti. And our families were friends, and my father and Nicholas spent a lot of time when I was young going back through the family tree so far as they could be reconstructed, and trying to work out whether there are any common ancestors, but there weren't any. But no, I come from another part of the Austro-Hungarian Habsburg Empire, from Vienna.
Thank you very much. Peter Kurti.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.